explorer rounds Cape Horn and sails up the Pacific Ocean of blizzard-packed country roads. For even a local man can know the way Magellan must have felt, being farther out than anyone else yet can travel, that feeling of being first and therefore important. Call him adventuresome or half crazy or both, these roads must be opened. Even around here, we need people willing to circumnavigate the globe and conquer the unknown, guided only by stars or by safety lights. I'm the oldest child, and my mom heard me read that poem one time, and she said, "Yep, I know which line pertains to you, first and therefore important." Again, I thank you all for coming out tonight, even though Don couldn't be here. I imagine a lot of you were tempted when you saw Don was not going to be here just to say to hell with it and stay home. I was, right? I admit that, right? One more of my poems, though, kind of a segue into Don's. I've written about Don's poetry a few times. I'll talk more about the collected works here in just a moment. I admire so many things about his work. But one thing that has struck me, especially in the later books, Don's poetry is willing to encounter the very, very worst that human beings have thrown at each other. Humans at their very, very worst. He's willing to encounter that, and yet remain optimistic. And so I wrote this in an article I wrote about one of his books. I said, defiantly optimistic. You can tell he's the small town athlete from years ago because he just refuses to be beaten. And I really like that spirit, and this is the spirit that I hope is behind the last poem in my book here. Also about a cemetery. Country cemetery. A certain magnetism draws you here to this North Pole, to its rows of Arctic white marble and stone. You've trekked here on the sled of self-pity, mushing its dogs with a whip. Here, everything arcs away down the globe. Greenland, Alaska, Siberia, the surrounding fields. And you are delighted. How quiet, how sunlit is the planet's tip. But once you have stood atop the world with no one else, you can go no farther as an explorer. Longing for home, the whole rest of the earth, you turn your sled around, and anywhere you go is south. This book was published by Rogue Faculty Press up in Ralston. A friend of mine who I went to college with was in Don's classes with me, Jeff Lacey and his friend Calvin Banks. They both teach at Ralston High School. And this book led to this one that we hope will come out in the next few months. Jeff and I were at a reading. He had organized a reading to launch this book, and we were having a sandwich afterwards. He bought me a sandwich, and then he gave me his gift, a bottle of Templeton Rye whiskey. So I was looking for something to keep my mind off that bottle of whiskey because I wanted to save that till I got home. But I said, hey Jeff, did you ever think about, now that you've got your press up and going, did you ever think about doing a complete works of Don Welch? And his face just lit up. What a great idea. And so I contacted Don about it. Of course, he was very enthusiastic about it. We weren't into the project very long before we realized a complete works was not realistic, nor did he really want every single one of his poems out there in a collect. So we decided on a collected works, or a really generously sized selected works. And so I met Don in about 1995, and so I had read pretty much everything of his from about 95 forward. One of the many enjoyable things about working on this book was reading the books from 1975 to 1995, some of the older things that he had written. I knew some of the more famous ones, or the more well-known ones, but it was really enjoyable to go back to some of his early things. He did not start writing poetry, folks, until he was in his 40s, his early 40s, which I now that I'm going to be 42 in the summer, I realize how impressive that is. He had some introductory works, you know, some things that were obviously him practicing, and it was not very long before he was writing world-class stuff. It wasn't more than a couple of years. The name of the book is a play on words, as I'm famous for, at Wayne High. Don, of course, is a racer of pigeons, and he often writes about his locale, the place where you are right now. And so I was walking my dog one day, and it hit me. Oh, duh! I know what it should be called. Homing. Okay. So anyway, Homing is a pretty good sized book. I think there's something like. It's going to be, at least in my manuscript that I've got here, it's pretty tattered, about 275 pages, quite a few selections from about 26 books, depending on how you count. And I'd like to read some of those earlier poems that I discovered again from his work as a way of getting started on his works tonight. If any of you have ever been to Don's house in Kearney, he has some of his poetic works up on the wall, and done by his friend Art Pierce, who's a calligrapher. My favorite by far is his poem The Marginalist, and if you've ever seen if I had my iPad I could show you, I've got a picture of it. If you've ever seen the picture that's up in his house, it's incredible. But a marginalist, if you don't know what one is the person from the Middle Ages who would fill up the margins with drawings and such in medieval manuscripts. So this is called The Marginalist. Before him are long, tall margins of vellum, and on the page the characters sacredly drawn. His pens sleep. Beside them the onyx eye of the ink, and he looks at the table. Then, opening small vessels of folium, of indigo and orpiment, white and red lead, he offers his hands. The kermes, or carmine red, weeps with Christ's blood, remembering. And the ultramarine, elaborately prepared by the Arabs and as precious as gold, rests in its silver cask, on which are peacock heads with eyes of lapis lazuli. A door creaks. Brother Jasper slips out for another night of the flesh. Down the hall, the old abbot himself falls dangerously into his sleep, the other cells collapsing in darkness. But in the marginalists, verdigris is opened, the extract of malachite. Outside, where the dark muscles its way toward the coast, or plays the empty eye holes of a Viking's mask, there is dead weight. But inside, there's oil light, and a slim green line that begins its pilgrimage across a maiden page. Whoa. That's a ton of fun to read. One of the poems that I discovered as I was working on this book of Don's is one that I think I read it years ago, but it doesn't really matter because I don't think I would have been able to really get it until I was old enough to be experienced to understand what it's like to write year after year after year. This is based on what Don has told me is a kind of a fictional situation, a return letter from Gerard Manley Hopkins' younger sister to Emily Dickinson. My dear Miss Dickinson, I regret to say my brother, Gerard Manley Hopkins, now in the north of Wales, is terribly ill. Could he would thank you for your poems, especially the one which begins, I cannot want it more, I cannot want it less. My human nature's fullest force expends itself on this. Young, in choice limbo, Gerard often sat at our kitchen table with his cursed, blessed words, in love with the oddest shapes. But I dare say, the right one found, he carried it home the way a Northumbrian would bring a lost sheep into the kitchen. His arms and shoulders dead, his spirit almost broken. Miss Dickinson, I do not understand my brother or his poems, but I know this. The right one made, he walks in peace, wearing its corona, and how long or brief it lasts is not the substantial question. And so I thank you for Gerard, whose words right now play across his body weekly. Next to the Father, though, silence has always been the best ghost for my brother. It also makes demands. In time, he may be strong enough to write again. He may be fit. If not, his life for it. Gerard Manley Hopkins' younger sister, winter 1874, in the reign of Christ our Lord and the Queen, Victoria. When I asked Jeff about doing the book, he said, okay, I will expect an introduction from you. And so while I enjoyed every minute of working on Don's book, that hung over my head. And I thought that's a really tough challenge. So what I decided to do was choose a poem and kind of take it apart and turn it into the intro. Which poem to do? I wrestled with all kinds. I wrestled with The Marginalist, the one I just read, a few more that I'll read. But there was that one that I could not figure out. I could never figure this poem out for years and years, and it wasn't until I worked on this book that I finally figured out the poem. That's the first of the 5 Irish pictures, and it's called The Glass Worker. For 40 years in such burned hands, the passionate quarrel. The way that his rigor held, then softened, spun into iridescences by line, tone, the elements of love. But near death, when the hard expression of himself in glass was not enough, he cradled the whiskey in his massive hands, saying, I want purer. Something like a last blown breath absent of regret would do, he said, or a simple taking off in which my own small pulse might become the last circumference of myself. I know I'm good, he said, but let's say in that moment, between my death and fame, there might be something light caught, pure, undreamed, even crystalline with good oblivion. Then, aware of the absurdity, he laughed. That's a tough one. Don taught me that you can write about Nebraska, and he also taught me that you can write about sports. So I chose a sports poem to do next. I like this poem because the title of it is To Vern About a Flanker. And the Vern referred to, I asked Don this years later, was Vern Plambeck, who was another professor that I had. Good old football poems. Breaking from the huddle, he begs a portrait no camera can give him, of his father running all day, of his mother catching eggs thrown from the lofts of barns. In the howling bowl of a Saturday afternoon, he watches a cornerback wave his forearm clubs, and then he's gone, beyond the free safety, measuring a liquid distance of yard lines, picking seams in the sunlight. Because this is the way he is, always was, stretched out, his toes just kissing the turf, a palm at the end of a crowd. Don, one of the best professional decisions I've ever made was asking Don for a letter of recommendation. I've never seen that letter, and never will, because it's something I agreed never to see. I don't know what's in that letter, but it sure gets people's attention, because I've gotten anything he's ever recommended before. And I got into, thanks to him also, I got into graduate school. And then about the time I was starting my first graduate classes, he sent me a little book of poems that he had done, where it was one poem for each month of the year. And this is one that really helped me through graduate school, because even as I was crucifying works of literature and cutting them up and deconstructing them and detesting every minute of it, I thought of this poem a lot, and I thought, this is the kind of writing I'd rather be doing. It's called March. Come, south wind, warm palm and pulse of crane time, sage the winds, turn our solitude inside out. Return the knots of ice to what they were at birth, beads of hope, clear mysteries of unwordable water. to what the clods and stalks and pavements drink. Come, purge us of our brittleness, make us adequate, be our aqueduct to spring. How many people can pun on adequate and aqueduct, right? That's tough to do. I'm impressed. I mean, okay. Another sports poem. I love those poems that kind of freeze a moment in time. That's what I tried to do with the poem Wren. This is a poem about a high jumper. And I did some work on this one in a class at Kearney, an education class, and I tried to get my education professor to understand this poem. It was very tough to do. We had a kid at Wayne High a few years ago, speaking of high jumpers. He's down here on the UNL track team. He high jumped 7 feet out of nowhere. Just typical, ordinary. He just kept going up and up and up, and he high jumped 7 feet, right? That was one of the 2 or 3 highest in the country that year. The high jumper. Looking at the standards, he closes his eyes, imagining himself a pure figure following a precise mathematical arc to the bar. And everything slows. Then he begins to close, whip-backed, gathering speed, shoving the weight of the universe down through his foot, his right arm shot up in a victory signal toward heaven. His right shoulder suddenly liquid, his hip bones thrust out. Then everything stops, and his body, floating, knows nothing more than itself, is calm, severe, solid, yet light. What is the sum of the length of ourselves? And stays that way, with no time over it, hurrying.